Okay, Assalamu alaikum again. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihil Kareem. On behalf of the Islamic Society of Britain and the Caribbean Muslim Network, we are very pleased to welcome you to our distinguished lecture series. And we are very fortunate again to have Dr. Shuruq Naguib, who will be presenting to us this afternoon. We were fortunate to have had her during the month of Ramadan, and her presentation was well received, quite provocative to some of us, but very engaging and well received. And therefore, we're very, very fortunate that she's back with us today. We have shared her bio, and for those of you who need to be reminded, or those of you who are joining us today for the first time, she's a lecturer of Islamic Studies at the University of Lancaster. Her research covers two key strands: the classical and pre-modern intellectual and textual tradition, and Muslim responses to modernity. She has led a project on women's contemporary readings of Islamic texts in Egypt and the UK between 2011 and 2012. Today her research is really groundbreaking for us and pioneering, and it's important in this world, in the world that we are in today, where there is great emphasis, placed on improving the condition of women, that we really try to go back to the original texts, to the Quran and the Sunnah, and to be able to determine, the rightful place of women in every sphere of activity, and also in terms of, ensuring that we correct the situation in which women's rights are violated, in terms of ensuring that we have social justice prevail. So without further ado, I would like to welcome again Dr. Shuruq Naguib, who is going to take us through her presentation, after which for about 30 minutes, Dr. Shuruq. And after which, we would open the floor for discussion. A warm welcome to my Caribbean sisters and brothers, as well as our sisters and brothers from the UK, from the US, from Canada, from all other parts of the world. So over to you, Dr. Shuruq.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for hosting me again. I really appreciated our previous discussion. And as Sharifa has kindly said, it was well received. My interpretation of well received is that there were many questions, and the comments did actually reflect that it stimulated discussion, although of course some of the observations rather than conclusions were perceived as moving beyond the acceptable within Islamic discourse. So in this presentation, perhaps today I will be reading again, as I did the first time, using my own textual literary approach. So I read the Quranic text, or different Quranic texts on gender, which are interpreted through the tafsir tradition or Quran commentaries in the pre-modern period by famous scholars such as Al-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, and others. And I read their readings as well. So I try to look at the Quran in the context of its reception. Some of you may have attended my session last time, which was about the mothers of the believers, how they became mothers of the believers, what the status of mothers of the believers entails, and whether it's an honorary status or a reconstruction through the revelation of the Quran of an agency or a role that goes beyond just elevating their status because of their proximity to the Prophet or for being wives of the Prophet, but rather, in my reading, based on the text of the Quran, but also some of the tafsir texts, the meaning of the role is changed in terms of how prophethood is conceived in the Quran, and they become part of the prophetic endeavor in transmitting revelation and transmitting the knowledge they learned in the house of the Prophet. So moving on from the talk last time, which was about the mothers of the believers and their status, I want to talk or to start with a woman who refused to become a mother of the believers. And that's an interesting position, because in the first session I talked about the choice that the wives of the Prophet were given a choice as to whether they accept the stringent moral criteria that comes with the role as laid out in Surah Al-Ahzab, Surah 33 in the Quran, by which they would be rewarded, doubly rewarded for their good deeds and doubly punished for any bad deed on their behalf. So a woman who refused to be a mother of the believer is Fakhita Hani. And the reason why I'm talking about women companions of the Prophet is an attempt to recover some of these stories and their implications, not only as role models for Muslim women today, but also as women who engaged constructively with the message of the Quran. Their behavior was informed by their understanding of the Quran. So Hani is the cousin of the Prophet, daughter of Abu Talib, and she's the older sister of Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet, husband of Fatima radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So Fakhita, known as Hani, was raised up with the Prophet, and he asked her hand in marriage before he married Khadija when they were young, and but she was already promised to another man called Hubayra ibn Abi Wahb, and she married him. When revelation came down, she accepted Islam, but her husband remained a mushrik, or a disbeliever. And she was one of the main companions of the Prophet, from whom we've received several important transmissions or hadith transmissions. Following the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet proposed to her again. But she appears at different instances in the seerah, including a visit to her house by the Prophet, during which he prayed the night prayer and slept, and was transported on the miraculous journey to Jerusalem. So the Al-Isra to Jerusalem, the journey we call Al-Isra based on the Quran, happened or started from her house. Her house was the station for that important event in the life of the Prophet. And one of the key incidents also in her life is that she continued to live in Mecca. She was not one of the Muhajirat. And after the conquest of Mecca, two disbelieving men begged for her protection. And she granted the two men her protection. And that kind of protection is similar to seeking asylum under international law in the modern world. And she granted them that asylum because individuals under tribal law in the Arab culture could grant asylum. And she, as a woman, after Islam, after the conquest of Mecca, so 20 or 21 years into the mission of Islam, she understood Islam to support the agency of women in granting asylum. So when Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu came seeking to seize those two men and perhaps kill them, she prevented him with her body. Although she was a divorced woman, or a woman who was separated from her disbelieving husband, and a single mother, and Ali was her brother, and she had several brothers, she did not accept or comply with his decision to take the men. And she went to the Prophet to seek his approval of this. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "We grant protection to whomever Hani has granted protection." The hadith surrounding the proposal of the Prophet can be found in Sahih Muslim. So the Prophet proposed to her in marriage a second time after the conquest of Mecca, and she refused the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. She refused his personal request to marry her, and she said, I'm of an advanced age with a large family. Thereupon he said, the women of Quraysh are good amongst the women folk. They ride camels and show affection to their children. So the Prophet ﷺ admired her decision to refuse to marry him in order to look after her children. There's another hadith surrounding the granting of asylum, which became quite an important textual evidence in the Islamic tradition on the discussion, on several discussions, not just on one discussion, a discussion on whether women are equal to men and whether individuals can grant asylum in their own right, and whether an individual granting asylum to another person, including disbelievers, can do so or need to seek permission from the governor or the public administrator. But the hadith that Hani has, or which is reported from Hani, is quite interesting because it shows us a perspective, a female perspective, and woman's voice as preserved in hadith material. So Hani reports in the first person, I went to the Messenger of Allah on the day we entered Mecca and found him taking a bath, and Fatima, his daughter, had provided him privacy with the help of a cloth. I gave him salutation and said, so she said salams to the Prophet ﷺ. Who is she? He asked, who is the woman? And she replied for herself, it is Hani, daughter of Abi Talib. He, the Holy Prophet, said, greeting for Hani. And when he had completed his bath, he did 8 rak'ahs, wrapped up in one cloth, as she describes. So she describes the circumstances of the encounter, which are very personal and within the family, and there is a kind of intimacy and proximity here in the context of seeking the Prophet's advice. When he turned back after the prayer, I said to him, Messenger of God, the son of my mother Ali ibn Abi Talib is going to kill a person, Fulan ibn Hubayra, whom I have given protection. Upon this, he said, we too have given protection, whom you have given protection, Hani. So we see the Prophet ﷺ validating the action of a woman, an action with public implications, because that man was one of the enemies of Islam and she has decided to protect him. This was her understanding of her ethical role as a Muslim woman whose refuge was sought, and she believed that she could grant that refuge. And when there was a dispute between her and her brother, she refused to comply without seeking the Prophet's advice on this. And it seems to me from reading the hadith, she was not just seeking permission from the Prophet, she was seeking validation of her action and interpretation of her right to grant safe passage or asylum for a period of time. And this is based on a Quranic verse which says, and if any of the disbelievers or mushrikun seek your protection, grant that person protection so that he may hear the word of God and then escort him to where he can be secure. So the female companions of the Prophet did not act simply out of their own accord, but out of their own understanding, general understanding of the message of the Quran. The surah in which this verse occurs is Surah At-Tawbah, and many mufassirs, many scholars of the Quran believe it was revealed after the conquest of Mecca. So potentially Hani did not hear that verse. Others believe that some of the verses were revealed long before the conquest of Mecca, perhaps a few years before the conquest of Mecca, on which the action of Hani was based on this specific Quranic injunction to grant safe passage or asylum to those who needed it until they hear the message of Islam. Whichever is the case, Hani had an understanding of her agency and right, which is equal to that of her brother. The hadith of Hani gave rise to two understandings of women's status, which is the interesting point here. There are, as I said, several discussions surrounding the right of a believing individual to grant safe passage and the right of a believing woman to grant safe passage. And that second point turns on whether women are equal to men. And it seemed to be a contested point, but some fuqaha, some jurists, some of those who studied Islamic law, accepted or based their opinion on the idea that the hadith clearly indicates equality between man and woman. I'm often asked the question, was Islam concerned with the idea of equality or gender, or are these modern conceptions that we are imposing on the Islamic tradition? And for those who read the text will, in some in-depth manner, they will realize that the question of equality of rights and duties and differences, biological as well as social, and how to mitigate the differences that arise from personal circumstances based on gender were concerns for pre-modern Muslim scholars, even though the term gender may not have been used in the modern sense, or equality is not based on the kind of liberal ideology that we encounter today, but there is an understanding of equality as equal agency and similar rights and duties. So the safe conduct guaranteed by women is permitted. That is a point of agreement because of the hadith. So a woman, a woman today in modern society can't grant anybody asylum, and those involved in activism with refugees know that quite well. It all depends on the state. However, in the early Muslim community, individuals' agency vis-a-vis public administration and state was actually broader and larger. Likewise, those who considered her equal to a man by way of analogy, both of them being human beings, made no distinction between them. So both can guarantee safe conduct without any differentiation. While those who considered that she had a defective legal capacity, so her legal capacity is not similar to that of man, and it's interesting to note that what is mentioned here is defective legal capacity and not biological deficiency or a kind of ontological differentiation between man and woman, because they have been created in different ways. Rather, this is a legal concept that she is not equal to man in everything. Those scholars who considered her defective in legal capacity as compared to a man did not permit such safe conduct for a woman to grant, except with as the discussion goes on to explain, except with the permission or validation of Wali al-Amr, or the guardian, or the public administrator. What is interesting, of course, is that debate does not presuppose that one view is more important than the other, or one view is more authoritative than the other. The text that I have read out is from Ibn Rushd, the Andalusian jurist who lived in Spain and who is known more as a philosopher, but he was also a jurist and has written an important book called the Distinguished Jurist's Primer, Bidayat al-Mujtahid. But women asserting their agency against male kin, as in the case of Fakhita Hani, when she granted safe conduct against her brother's wishes, who was an important companion, and the brother's own the Prophet's own adopted brother after Hijrah. There is also Khansa bint Khidam al-Ansariya, who was given in marriage by her father when she was a divorcee or a widow. The narrations that we have surrounding her don't explain. She disliked that marriage. She disliked being given in marriage without her own consent, and she goes to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, to contest that. And the Prophet validates her concerns and declares the marriage invalid. There's also the example of Buraira. Again, here we see women believing that Islam, that faith, their faith in God and His Prophet, and their understanding of the Quran gives them agency within their families and within their communities, which may not be accepted by their male kin or the men in their community, but they believe that it will be validated by the Prophet and by the Quran. And one of the most important examples I will show you is that of Khawla bint Thalaba, about whom a whole surah is named, and the first passage of which has been revealed, Surah Al-Mujadila, Surah number 58. So there is another female companion who was a former slave called Buraira, and we are told through the hadith material that Buraira went to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet and mother of the believers, to help her with getting her emancipation. And Sayyidah Aisha helps her financially with a lump sum to get her full manumission. And as soon as she gets her full manumission, Buraira or Barira, Barira's husband, who's a slave, becomes separated from her because she's a free woman, and a free woman can revoke her own marriage to a slave. So her husband Mughith is seen crying in tears in the market, and the Prophet ﷺ is emotionally moved by his sadness and by his love to his wife, and tells his uncle Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, "O Abbas, are you not astonished at the love of Mughith for Barira and the hatred of Barira for Mughith?" And the Prophet then feels moved enough to intercede on behalf of Mughith, and he goes to Barira and asks her, "Why don't you return to him?" And she says to him, "O Messenger of God, do you order me to do so? So is this a prophetic order?" And he says, "No, I only intercede in a private capacity on his behalf." And on this, she says, "I'm not in need of him." And again, the Prophet does not contest or condemn her sense of her own independence to make that decision, because that is not a divine order. And in that social context, she has the right to decide whether she wanted to remain married to that man or not. And in all these examples, I would say that the women, as you know, depending on how much material do we know about them, seem to reflect a kind of interpretation of the Quran that has a practical implication for their lives and their morality as they embody the morality of the Quran in their own story. And as I just mentioned, one of these women who we get to know a lot about is a woman called Khawla bint Thalaba, according to most reports, and Surah Al-Mujadila is revealed about her. And the surah is itself called the Woman Disputant or the Dispute. The opening passage is very powerful, and I have presented this surah on many occasions to different audiences because it does not get enough attention. We mentioned that there is a chapter about women in the Quran, a chapter about Mary. I personally talked about the Prophet's wives in the Quran, but this marginal woman in the community is rarely talked about, and there needs to be some awareness of the implications of her presence in the Quran. So the opening verse says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, "Indeed, Allah has heard the statement of her who disputes with you concerning her husband and complains to God, and God hears the argument between you both. Verily, Allah is all hearer, all seer." The Quranic Arabic is quite powerful because it associates the woman and God hearing her in one sentence in a very intimate linguistic structure. This is encoded or encapsulated in the first verse without mentioning much detail about the situation itself. قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها. So God has heard the speech of that woman who is speaking to the Prophet or who is disputing with the Prophet. وتشتكي إلى الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears that complaint and responds to it. This chapter and the first passage is actually addressing a complaint about a pre-Islamic practice called bihar. Bihar is a form of divorce which I mentioned last time in the context of Surah Al-Ahzab, which pronounces a woman to be like a mother to her husband. So the husband says to a woman, you are to me like my mother's back. And that pre-Islamic form of divorce or ignorant kind of divorce suspends the status of woman as wife. So she's no longer a wife, but she's no longer also a divorcee free to marry another. So her agency is extremely restricted and her rights are almost suspended as woman. This indefinite status is the worst punishment that a husband could pronounce at will and whimsically upon a wife. And there is no solution to it. So there is no way to revoke it. That chapter is revealed about this kind of divorce after the Battle of Al-Khandaq in year 5, and it is referenced very, very briefly in Surah Al-Ahzab or chapter 33, which we looked at last time. And just by way of reminder, that chapter starts with, in the first few verses, especially verses 4 to 6, to mention that men are not allowed to pronounce other people or to give other people status within their family without following a particular divinely ordained path. So God says here that those who divorce their wives saying, be as my mother's back, these women are not truly their mothers. And those who have made their adopted sons their sons, they are not their true fathers. However, in the same surah, God makes the wives of their prophet their mothers, and hence juxtaposing the actions and agency of men as limited and God's as unlimited. And men cannot choose to make wives mothers and cannot choose to do not have that kind of power over others in their community. The historical effect of Surah Al-Mujadila is quite fascinating because it was not simply received as a prohibition on bihar, but it was also received as permitting individuals, believing individuals, to seek truth where truth is concealed or not manifest. So we have an example here from Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. He's a Maliki jurist and Andalusian who produced a tafsir of the Quran with, or a Quran commentary with a legal interest. He lists 29 rulings, not all related to vihar or that form of divorce. The second ruling, so the first ruling is surrounding vihar. The second ruling pertains to the permissibility or even the recommended status of the action of seeking truth and seeking to manifest it. Now, there are a number of interesting things here to consider, maybe a bit more to go slowly over and to consider a bit more deeply. The person who is mentioned in the Quran as seeking a resolution is a woman. She's not named, so we don't know who she is through the Quran. and she's disputing with the Prophet, and she's complaining to God. So she's not accepting whatever response she's being given by the Prophet and waiting for revelation. And that will become apparent when we look at the material of occasions of revelations, or what the hadith material tells us about what happened on that day. So there is a woman involved, and she is protesting an injustice and seeking truth, and that seeking of truth, so she's not simply answered by divine revelation, but divine revelation validates her action of seeking truth and seeking to manifest it, without regard to gender, without regard to position in society, without regard to anything but the complaint that the ambiguity of the answer surrounding the issue of dihar before revelation. So before the verse, before that passage was revealed, Muslims didn't know what to do in the case when a man pronounces a dihar. And that woman's husband apparently was the first to do it after Hijrah, after the immigration to Medina. So there's ambiguity, and in order to decide that truth needs to be sought, you need to assess a situation as problematic. And to assess a situation as problematic, you need some ethical or moral presuppositions about in order to use in assessing the situation. All of this, so Khawla's own presuppositions, her own decision to seek truth, her own act of protest or disputation with the Prophet, all of this is validated and seen as permissible. So the reception of that story in the Revelation as encoded in the first four verses, we see in the tafsir tradition, and I use Al-Tabari as representing a range of reports. I won't be able to go through all of them, but the range of reports tell us exactly how that passage was received, how the story was understood. So what happened exactly? He mentions 18 exegetical traditions, so 18 early Quran interpreters commented on that passage and the story behind it. And the story and the commentary was often about the detail of the event or the incident of disputation, at the end of which there was this revelation. But the points of agreement are interesting. So there was a woman who argued with the Prophet, and that it was regarding her husband, and her husband was called Aus ibn Samit. He was the brother of the companion Ubadah ibn Samit, quite an important figure in early Islam. And he said to her, Anti alayya ka dhahri ummi, you are to me like my mother's back. And that her argument was in the form of refusing to accept the response of the Prophet on the matter of the heart. So there is agreement in the various reports, the 18 reports mentioned by Al-Tabari. Not all of them are hadith or have been transmitted through hadith, some of which have come through early Quran commentators. There is agreement that it was a woman who was disputing, and it was about her husband, and that she was going back and forth with the Prophet, not accepting his view. So these are the points of agreement, and the points of disagreement turn on these components. The majority agree that her name is Khawla, but others give other names. I'll call her Khawla because this is the majority opinion. And some say that the incident happened in the house of the Prophet, others located in the mosque of the Prophet. And the content of the speech, the majority agree that she was complaining about her humiliating husband's behavior, and some say that she was upset because she loved him too much. But the hadith material focus on her sense of humiliation, as we'll see. The response of the Prophet is interestingly reported again in different ways. So sometimes he said, be patient, and sometimes he said, the dihar is effective and there is no going back on that. in terms of the rest of the passage that was revealed, it included reference to ways of revoking the dhihar or penance to be done on behalf or to be done by the husband or on his behalf. Most of the hadith mentioned that it was Khawla who received the revelation from the Prophet, and a few reports mentioned that her husband was called in he was summoned by the Prophet ﷺ, and when he was summoned, it was him who acted and performed the penance. And some scholars argue that some of these hadiths which bring back the husband into the picture are trying to improve his image, because the Quran, together with the authentic hadith, give an image of the husband as actually having weak agency, weak moral character, and weak understanding, whereas the woman was much more ethically oriented, much more proactive in her approach, and that her position is validated even against that of her husband on many respects. So some of these hadiths are coming through the male perspective. So we get the story as if Khawla doesn't exist in the story and it's all about the husband. But the two important hadith in Bukhari and Musnad Ahmad give the story from the perspective of Khawla, and one of them is narrated by Aisha. In the following few slides, in the next 10 minutes, I'll just focus on Khawla's perspective. Ahmad records that Khuwaila bint Thalaba was transmitting, following in the post-revelatory period, was proud that the Quran was revealed about her. And she said, by Allah, Allah sent down the beginning of the chapter of the woman disputant about me and my husband. And she describes her husband at the time as having grown old and difficult, and that on the day that this happened, they argued about something mundane, and he said to her in anger, "You are like my mother's back." And then he went out and sat with his people or friends and came back forgetting about what he pronounced and wanted to have sexual intercourse with him. And Khawla at that point recalls that she said to her husband, "No, by the one in whose hand is the soul of Khuwaila, you will not have your way with me." And this actually reminds us of the many hadith that are sometimes used within ceremonies and within the community and by men in households, that the angels will curse a woman who does not allow her husband to have his way with her, without understanding the context of those hadith at all. In this context, Khawla is not thinking about the cursing of the angels. She's thinking about the misbehavior of her husband as pronouncing the dhihar and seeing it as her right through her knowledge of prophetic teachings and the Quran to say no. And when he tries, she takes a vow by God. So this is a very serious pronouncement on her behalf, by the one in whose hand is the soul of Khawla, you will not have intercourse with me. So she takes a vow against her husband until there is a pronouncement on that by God and his messenger. However, the husband is portrayed by Khawla as not minding her vow and not minding his own vow, which is dhihar, to pronounce her as his mother, and still pushing for his desire. And Khawla decides to push back. She pushes him and she says, he wanted to do this regardless of my choice, and I pushed him away from me. He was an old man. We see Khawla here acting and believing or acting on a presupposition that she has the full right to decide ethically what the right action is in this context. This is what I would call, without going into too much theoretical language, a pretext. So before the revelation surrounding dhihar in Surah Al-Mujadila is revealed, Khawla has an expectation of the Quran to support, a more just form of action, a more just path. That's the pretext, the presupposition before the revelation of the text. And this is a kind of, I would call, interpretative agency. She has an interpretation of the Quran already from what she has received through the Prophet and what she has seen of the Quran as embodied in the early community. This is also what I call practical hermeneutics, which means interpretation embodied in action through our lives. So going back to borrow the term of Al-Qadi ibn al-Arabi, seeking that truth manifests, this is exactly the kind of practical interpretation or practical hermeneutics I'm talking about, or I'm trying to think about with you. So Khawla, in seeking that to make truth manifest, she goes to the neighbors, borrows a garment because she's a poor woman. She doesn't have a decent cloak to wear as she goes into the Prophet's house. And when she arrives, she tells him of what happened and keeps complaining of the ill treatment she has received from her husband. And the Prophet's response, according to Khawla's report, is that he says, your cousin is an old man, so have fear of Allah regarding him. So the Prophet cannot revoke a normative practice, a dominant practice in Arab society without revelation. But it's also reminiscent of how many authorities and scholars within the community in the first instance tell the woman to be patient. In response to that, Khawla, with all due reverence and love for the Prophet, she insists that there has to be a solution. And that's why there is jidal, that's why there is disputation, because she's not arguing in a negative way with the Prophet. She's trying to explain to the Prophet that she believes there is a solution that God will reveal surrounding her. And the divine response does come, alleviating the hardship that her husband has imposed on her, and alleviating the hardship of not having an answer. The Prophet ﷺ had no answer, but was obviously sympathetic to her call for a more just solution. So the divine response comes saying, according to Khawla, by Allah, before I departed, parts of the Quran were revealed about me, and Allah's messenger felt the hardship receiving the revelation, so he would sweat and go into deep silence. And when revelation ended, the Prophet was jovial, he was happy. He told her, "Oh Khuwaila, Allah has revealed something about you and your spouse." He was sympathetic to the cause, obviously, and he recited to Khawla. And in all this, we see Khawla as part of the making or the occasioning of revelation, something I've mentioned last time, that women were not only the subject of revelation, so the Quran doesn't just talk about women, but women played an important role in bringing about revelation. And if we think that the Quran is an inimitable, excellent text in its language, then the idea of a surah or a chapter starting with God highlighting that he has heard the statement of a woman is of great significance, in that the woman and her story and her choice to act and seek the truth has been the way through which, or the mode through which, the Quran has been revealed. So I use a term that some people might find difficult to absorb or swallow, which is that there are many important passages in the Quran for which women have been midwives. And in this case, the Surah Al-Mujadila, Khuwaila bint Tha'laba was the midwife of the first passage of Surah Al-Mujadila. So again, Khuwaila, who was disputing with the Prophet, as he was telling her revelation, as documented in Ahmad ibn Hanbal, in Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, we find her receiving revelation and still arguing with revelation through the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So the Prophet tells Khuwaila, command him to free a slave. So the text highlighted with bold is the Quranic text, and the rest is her text in Musnad Ahmad. And she says, in response, "Oh Allah's Messenger, he does not have any to free. He's too poor. He can't do this." Even though, so instead of, the Prophet saying to her, "But the Quran has given you a way out. Go and find, go and borrow the money to buy a slave and free a slave or whatever." There is no pressure on the woman to comply in the first instance. Rather, there is another piece of revelation that comes, "Let him fast for 2 consecutive months." And at that point, she says, even that he can't do. He's an old man and cannot fast. So we see her as an interlocutor, as in dialogue, not only with the Prophet, but also with the Quran. And in all this, she believes in God's justice and mercy to take note of her poverty and her status and the circumstances of her husband. So eventually, the Quran is revealed to give a third way out. Let him feed 60 poor people a wasak of dates. And she says to that, he doesn't have any of that. And the Prophet intervenes, and they both get a basket of date together and perform the penance on the behalf of the husband, whose only agency, as mentioned in that report, is to pronounce a zihar and wanting to follow his sexual desire with his wife without consideration of what he has done. So here we see an example of a woman who acts practically and ethically in line with her understanding of the Quran, and her action is validated and supported by both the Quran and the prophetic response. I think I'll stop here, but maybe I would like to say a few things toward the end about what that validation means, the validation of her action as captured in Al-Qadi ibn al-Arabi's understanding of the second ruling of the verse, which is permitting believing individuals to seek truth actively, not just intellectually, but also within their communities. So the activism, both intellectual and ethical and social, are permissible in that case. So the validation of this entails, in my view, a presupposition about the ethical purpose of the text. The Quran is not just for producing rulings about specific circumstances, but it should inspire individuals to seek truth in circumstances which are new and which posit questions we don't have answers for. And that men and women have the right and are under the obligation to do so to the best of their understanding. And that the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the divine, is receptive of that activism as a kind of interpretation of the message of the Quran. And that individual ethical judgment is necessary before acting, before seeking the truth. So we all have to make some kind of ethical judgment based on our understanding. And that woman was no scholar. She has received no ijazas. She has only received revelation through the Prophet and was a member of the community. She wasn't even a close companion. She was a marginal woman who didn't have a garment to appear in public. And that the text of the Quran, or the ethical message of the Quran, facilitates actions of protest against normative practice on which the text is silent. So the Quranic text doesn't pronounce a judgment or a ruling on every practice in the world within societies. People have a duty to judge some normative practices, even though they might be customary or dominant, as unethical, and to have some gut feeling about their unethicality, and to seek truth by going to religious authorities, by doing the research and going through the education, whatever mode of seeking truth that requires humility and patience and perseverance to seek that truth and find it. But the text enables protest, enables disputation, enables one's ethical judgment as believers. And we also see that it validates and permits disputation with religious authority. The Quran at no point in this chapter condemns Khawla for staying for too long and arguing for too long and insisting on a solution. And in the hadith in Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, she's even responding to the Quran itself and saying, well, that path won't work for us. We don't have enough wealth to free a slave. And that path won't work for my husband. He's too ill, he's too old. And that path actually also wouldn't work. At which point the Prophet helps her without condemning her and telling her, oh woman, you nag too much, you complain too much, which is something that we hear often within private context and public.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shuruq.
Thank you.
Yes, I know you're very excited about this, and this has been a very stimulating and provocative conversation. Without further ado, I think I would like to bring the meeting to a close. We've gone about 10 minutes over our scheduled time, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank again the Islamic Society of Britain for the technical support, for the advertising, the marketing. We apologize for the technical, glitches that we've had. Sincere apologies for that, and also to thank the Secretariat of the Caribbean Muslim Network, and of course all of you for taking time off on your Sunday afternoon. We know how much we value and cherish our leisure time on a Sunday afternoon. So we really would like to thank you for participating. And of course, finally, to thank Dr. Shuruq for really sharing, some of these very provocative. I like to use the word provocative, ideas, and the pioneering research that she's doing, on the companions of the Prophet, mothers of the believers, and looking at issues regarding equality of women, activism, social justice. And equality, really. So I thank you, and I
thank you.
Say Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.